Jesus represents the fulfillment of all the divine covenants made since the dawn of creation. The Old Testament was a story in search of an ending. In Jesus, the story finds its conclusion in a way that no human, not even all the prophets, could have anticipated. I'm Rob Corzine. Join me and Dr. Scott Hahn as we continue our discussion tracing the story of the Bible through salvation history. That's up next on Genesis to Jesus. Welcome to Genesis to Jesus, our ongoing conversation tracing the story of the Bible through salvation history. I'm Rob Corzine, and it's my pleasure to have this conversation with you and with my good friend and teacher, Dr. Scott Hahn. Welcome back, Scott.
It's great to be with you again, Rob.
Scott Hahn is professor of Scripture and Theology at Franciscan University of Steubenville, the president of the St. Paul Center for Biblical Theology, and the author of many books, including the book that we're drawing from today, A Father Who Keeps His Promises. Scott, we've come now all the way from creation through the whole Old Testament, and we're to the fulfillment, to Jesus. In this show, if we could just focus in on the first gospel, the Gospel of Matthew, sometimes called the Gospel of the Kingdom.
Right. Well, I think we see Matthew as a Jewish Christian and one of the 12 disciples, writing most likely for other Jewish Christians to show how Jesus is the Christ and therefore the fulfillment of all the covenants, but especially the Davidic kingdom covenant, which we've seen in previous weeks was sort of like the last in the Old Testament and what brings us to the very threshold of the new. And I mean, he doesn't waste any time. From the very opening of Matthew, chapter 1, verse 1, we read the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David. And so we have this Davidic genealogy which shows Jesus' royal pedigree. And the very way that Matthew structures it, there are three sets of 14. 14 generations from Abraham to David, 14 more from David to the exile, and then 14 still from the exile to Joseph and Mary. And why? Well, we might not know, but Matthew and his Jewish Christian readers understood because in Hebrew there aren't any numbers. It's a lot like in Latin where you have Roman numerals. Letters are assigned a numerical value. In the case of David's name, David consists of three letters, three consonants, Daleth, Wow, Daleth. And when any Jew looks at those three letters, he can see 4 plus 6 plus 4 because those three letters add up to 14. And so what Matthew is counting on is that his Jewish Christian readers can see the royal pedigree, the Davidic genealogy in chapter 1. And he structures it in a way that makes it especially unmistakable for his original audience. In Matthew chapter 2, after the Davidic genealogy, you have a Davidic birthplace. The same place David was born, Bethlehem, is where Jesus is born. And you also have these prophecies concerning the virgin conceiving, the Queen Mother back in Isaiah 7, and the Magi coming to visit. Why? Because the Gentiles were originally a part of the Davidic kingdom covenant. And so from the outset, they are here as well. And then in Matthew chapter 3, you have a Levite named John the Baptist, and what does he do? He anoints the son of David, and at the climax of this baptismal narrative, you have the voice from heaven declaring, he's not just the son of David, he's the son of God. I mean, he's ticking off the list of all of the characteristic features of the Davidic kingdom covenant, that the son of David is the son of God, and the christening by a Levite is what reveals this. And so not surprisingly, in chapter 4, after the Davidic genealogy, the birthplace, as well as the anointing, we have the Davidic proclamation of the gospel of the kingdom in Matthew 4, verse 17. And where does Jesus go? Specifically to Galilee, precisely where Isaiah had announced the judgment is going to begin in Galilee and the disintegration of the Davidic kingdom, but then the restoration of the Davidic kingdom is going to occur precisely where the disintegration began. So Jesus goes to Capernaum and fulfills the prophecy concerning the restoration of the kingdom. And for the first time in Matthew's gospel, this is where he proclaims the gospel of the kingdom of heaven. And so, I mean, we're off and running. We're off to the races. And by the time you get to chapter 5, we begin the first of 5 speeches that you find throughout Matthew, and this is probably the most famous. It's the Sermon on the Mount. Right. And it runs from Matthew 5 all the way through 6 till the end of chapter 7. And Davidic kingdom covenant themes are shot throughout this sermon, just like the first 4 chapters. In the beginning, chapter 5, we have the Beatitudes. And these are very familiar to any Christian reader. But what we often fail to notice is that the first and the last of the Beatitudes begin with the promise of the kingdom. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom. And blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom. So again, to reinforce this Davidic covenant theme of fulfillment. And then as soon as the Beatitudes are done, Jesus uses 3 images to describe his followers. They're the salt of the earth, they're the light of the world, and they're a city set on a hill. Well, the city set on a hill is obvious. That would refer to Jerusalem. Likewise, the light of the world is a quotation from Isaiah 49, verse 6, which speaks of Zion and how Jerusalem is to be a light to the nations, a light to the world. And even the language of salt of the earth is drawn from 2 Chronicles 13, verse 5, where the prophet announces that God's covenant with David and his sons concerning the kingdom is permanent. Indeed, it is a covenant of salt. And so from chapters 1 through 4 up until the Sermon on the Mount, beginning in chapter 5, you have the steady stream of Davidic typology, these images that were promised and now are reaching their fulfillment. And then you have this all-important statement where Jesus says, don't think that I've come to abolish the law, but rather I've come to fulfill it. And then he goes on to emphasize how that unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you'll never enter not the nation of Israel, but the kingdom of heaven. And this is an important distinction because the scribes and the Pharisees basically used for their standard of righteousness not the Davidic covenant, but the Mosaic covenant. The Torah of Moses was the principle of their own nationalistic civic virtue and the measure of that. Whereas Jesus is saying, no, the program has advanced from Moses to David, from Sinai to Zion. So your righteousness has to exceed that of what Moses gave us back at Sinai in Deuteronomy. And so in the next part of chapter 5, he gives us 6 antitheses. You've heard that it was said, but I say to you. And what he's doing is he's taking the Mosaic law and saying, oh no, this is going to be radical. This is going to be more internalized. This is going to be intensified. It's not just dealing with civic virtue. It's talking about the heart. It's not just talking about a citizen, it's talking about a saint. And over again, he is taking the righteousness as it advanced from Sinai to Zion, from the nation to the kingdom, and applying that to the disciples to show that you're not just called to Israelite citizenship. You are called to kingdom holiness.
That was good, but not good enough.
That's right. And so by the time we get to chapter 6, which is the centerpiece of the Sermon on the Mount, we have the most famous prayer. That is the Our Father. And it's significant because it begins, Our Father, in a way that not even the most devout rabbi ever dared to address the God of Israel. Jesus only addresses God as Father throughout the Gospels, but now he's teaching the disciples to pray in a way that nobody ever did before. Our Father who art in heaven, thy kingdom come. So you have that language conjoined, because you remember that the Son of David is adopted with the grace of divine sonship to become the Son of God, and Solomon is the first person to be referred to as the Son of God in salvation history, but what he had, now all of Jesus' disciples are called upon.
Yeah, at that point it was just the king, but now, and in the liturgy we say, we dare to say,
that's right,
Our Father.
That's right, and for us it doesn't seem all that daring, but back then it was unthinkable. And in the Sermon on the Mount, you actually find so many references to God as Father. I count 17, which is more than the entire Hebrew Bible put together, and that's just Jesus' first public sermon that Matthew gives us. And why? Again, because the Davidic kingdom covenant is apportioning this amazing grace that enables us to come to know God as Father in a way that only Solomon approximated back in the Old Testament. By the time you get through chapter 7 and reach the climax of the Sermon on the Mount, you've heard many different Solomonic themes. Not even Solomon in all of his glory was arrayed like the lilies of the field. He speaks of the Jerusalem and the temple and all of that. But by the time he reaches the conclusion of the Sermon on the Mount, he has this very important statement where you don't just have to hear my words, you have to do them. because the one who hears my words and does them will be like a wise man who builds his house upon a rock. Now, when he says that, that might sound kind of new to us, but to ancient Jews in the first century, that was very familiar. A wise man, well, who was the wisest of men? Solomon. Who builds his house? What was the greatest of houses? The Jerusalem temple that Solomon built. He builds it upon a rock. Well, where did Solomon build the temple of Jerusalem? We know from 2 Chronicles 3, verse 1, that he built it there in Zion, but especially on the Even Shetiyah, the foundation stone that was laid in Zion. So a wise man builds his house upon a rock. What Solomon did as the wisest of men, building the greatest of houses, the temple, upon the largest of rocks, that foundation stone, is what we're all now called to do by listening to the teachings and implementing them of the Son of David, who is the Son of God, who now gives to us this boldness, this humility, this capacity to address God as Abba, Father. I mean, by the time you get to the end of the Sermon on the Mount, you realize what a revolution in world religious history Jesus has launched by giving to all of his disciples what only the king of Israel ever dared to do. And even Solomon didn't address God in prayer as Abba, Father.
Yeah. Not only are we now going to call God our Father, but just by hearing his words and doing them, we are like Solomon.
That's right. And what's so interesting is that in the ensuing narrative of Matthew 8 and 9, Jesus shows it's not just theory, it's practice. I'm not just talking about a superior righteousness versus the scribes and the Pharisees, a kingdom righteousness that is Davidic and not just the Mosaic righteousness that was back in the days of Sinai. He displays this in a series of miracles, the first of which has this leper approaching Jesus and the disciples. While the scribes and the Pharisees are spying on him, the leper says, "If you will, I can be clean." And Jesus doesn't just say, "I will it, stay back or else I can contract impurity from a leper." Right. He reached out and touched the leper, at which point the scribes and the Pharisees would say, according to the law of Moses, he's defiled, except for one thing, the leper is cleansed, to show that the righteousness of Christ is much more powerful than what the scribes and the Pharisees have. Then the next episode is a centurion who is concerned about his servant, and he approaches Jesus and says, he's sick, can you heal him? Jesus could have said, well, clear out of the promised land, give it back to us, maybe then I'll consider it. You're an outsider, you're an occupation soldier. No, he says, I'll enter your house and do that. And the centurion is like, do you know who I am? I'm a man under authority, just say the word and my servant shall be healed. And Jesus does, and he is. And the centurion and the disciples and the scribes and the Pharisees are like, he would have entered a Gentile home? Unthinkable. And then as you continue reading, you read about this hemorrhaging woman who, according to the law of Moses, had been hemorrhaging for 12 years. She is not only defiled, but defiling anybody she touches. She reaches out and secretly touches him. But instead of defiling him, he cleanses her. And that's en route to a home where a young girl at the age of 12 had died. He enters the room, contracts the worst kind of defilement, corpse impurity, except for one thing. He raises her from the dead.
Not a corpse anymore.
Yeah, right. So a leper, a Gentile, the hemorrhaging woman, and a corpse. Jesus shows how he's overturning the standard of righteousness that you have in the Mosaic covenant precisely by fulfilling the Davidic kingdom covenant. Rich stuff.
Indeed.
I know we have to take a break, but there's even more coming up afterwards.
Stay with us on Genesis to Jesus. Welcome back to Genesis to Jesus. We're here today in the Gospel of Matthew, and before the break you were talking about how Jesus is the fulfillment and is showing the fulfillment of the Davidic covenant.
That's right. It was like trying to take a sip from a fire hydrant, I
You're
know,
telling me.
going through the first 9 chapters. But that torrent continues into chapters 11, 12, and 13 in a way that is even richer. By the time you get to chapter 12, you discover that Jesus is saying something greater than the temple is here in verse 6. The scribes and the Pharisees are baffled because for them, there is nothing greater than the temple. And yet he continues to heal. And then the people respond, can this be the Son of David? Because they recognize this divine power. And it's interesting because the scribes and the Pharisees reject him as such and oppose him. And so Jesus recognizes that they're the people who are responsible for the earthly Jerusalem. So he then warns about how forces can divide God's kingdom. He says, no kingdom divided against itself will stand. No city divided, no house divided. Now for us, those are just three random images.
Right.
But for Matthew's audience, it's the kingdom of David, it's the city of David, and it's the house of David, which on earth is basically watched over and run by the scribes and the Pharisees, showing us that there is about to be a fulfillment that changes from the earthly Jerusalem to the kingdom of heaven, the heavenly Jerusalem. And so the people who are dividing the kingdom and the city and the house must be superseded, must be overcome. And it's interesting too, because by the time you get to Matthew 12:42, Jesus has said not only is something greater than the temple here, but something greater than Solomon. And so in chapter 12, we have this torrent of Davidic and Solomonic and temple images to make it clear that the people who are exercising faith are seeing the mystery that the scribes and the Pharisees are clearly missing. But the fact that he compares himself to Solomon and says greater than Solomon is what sets the stage for chapter 13, where we have the 7 kingdom parables.
So there's a restoration here, but it's more than a restoration. This is not back to where we were. The kingdom of heaven is Davidic, but it's not going back.
Yeah, that's right. It's a fulfillment that exceeds the expectations and surpasses the hopes of the ancient Israelites. I mean, we'd have to say. In Matthew 13, we have 7 kingdom parables that are an echo of Solomon, because Solomon, of course, was associated with Proverbs. In Hebrew, those are called mashalim. They can be translated into Greek as parabole, where we get the word parables. So just as Solomon taught in parables or proverbs, so now Jesus, for the first time in Matthew's gospel, lets loose with a torrent of 7 parables that all reveal the kingdom. The mystery of the kingdom of heaven may be compared to, and then there's a series of these that show that the heavenly kingdom, when it is manifested on earth, is not going to be utopian. It's going to be a mixed bag. So the first of the 7 parables displays this sower who throws the seed out onto the soil. And it's really more of the parable of the soils, because some falls on the path where the birds get it, some falls, some of the seed falls on the rocky ground, and some on the thorny soil. So there are 3 kinds of bad soil that don't really bear fruit. And then there are 3 kinds of good soil that bear a harvest of 30, 60, and 100-fold. So when the word of God comes and the kingdom of heaven is manifested, there's going to be a division. Those who are really worldly are not going to get it. Those who are really ordering their minds and their lives to the kingdom of heaven are going to get it to varying degrees. And what's interesting is that the next parable displays the same kind of twofold mixture. That is, the man who goes out and sows the wheat, and then at night his enemy sows the weeds, the tares. And so growing alongside of each other, you have the kingdom of heaven manifested on earth with wheat and weeds growing up alongside of each other. Well, that clearly isn't a picture of what heavenly glory will be, but it is a picture of what my parish is like and yours is as well.
Yeah, and that really kind of is maybe the answer to the famous question that Alfred Loisy asked. Jesus promised us the kingdom, and it looks like all we got was the church.
That's right. And for a lot of people, when Jesus promises the kingdom and gives us the church, that's either a broken promise or an unfulfilled, or a postponed fulfillment. Well, I don't think it's anything of the kind, because we have to recognize that there aren't 2 things, a kingdom up there and a church down here. There aren't 2 churches, there's one, in heaven and on earth, in glory and in grace. There aren't 2 liturgies, one up there and one down here. There is one that unites us. And this is the mystery of the kingdom that Jesus is sort of preparing his disciples to grasp, probably because they, like most first century Jews, expected the fulfillment of the Davidic covenant to restore a kingdom in its earthly form, whether it would be military and liturgical or whatever. But in fact, what Jesus is doing is fulfilling it in an entirely transformed and transposed way. And so as you go down the other parables, you begin to recognize that Jesus is impressing upon them other aspects of the mystery. The 3rd parable is the mustard seed. So the kingdom of heaven is going to look really small when it's on earth. And then the next parable is the parable where you have 11 where you have leaven hidden in the bread to cause it to rise. So again, the heavenly kingdom, as it's manifested on earth, is going to be hidden. So it's going to be small like mustard seed. It's going to be hidden like leaven. And then the fifth parable is the treasure hidden in the field. The field is the world. The treasure is the gospel of the kingdom. So people are going to have to assess the relative value of the world compared to this. Sell everything, get the field just to get that treasure. And likewise, the pearl of great price. And then the last parable, I think in some ways, is the most revealing of all, because it's the dragnet that the fishermen use to scoop the fish up. And what do you have at the end? Well, you have good fish, but you also have junk. And so the kingdom of heaven, down through the ages, is going to be manifested in a church with wheat and weeds, with good fish, but also junk. But at the end of the age, at the end of the world, it won't be like that. So clearly, when Jesus is announcing the gospel of the kingdom, showing that this is the fulfillment of the Davidic covenant, he is doing it in a way that is going to be distinct. It's going to be glorious in heaven, but it's going to be a mixed bag on earth. That's precisely what enables us to see that the Catholic Church is the kingdom that Christ has come to establish, manifested in the 7 parables in chapter 13, but in the subsequent chapters of Matthew as well.
Indeed.
I was thinking of Matthew 16. Can I press
Please,
the fast forward?
You read my mind.
Yeah. Well, in Matthew 14 and 15, you see him feeding the 5,000 and the 4,000. He's feeding Israelites and he's feeding Gentiles to show how it's going to be in the kingdom. And by the time you get to chapter 16, he is asking these disciples of his, who do men say that the Son of Man is? And Jeremiah, John the Baptist, one of the prophets. And then he puts the question right to them, as he would to us, who do you say that the Son of Man is? And here again we have Simon Peter speaking up on behalf of the other 11, but really as the leader and the spokesman. He says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. In Greek, that is, you are the Christos, the anointed one, the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Now you can hear in Davidic terms, that's 2 ways of saying the same thing, because the Christ is the Son of David, but he's also the Son of God. And so what does Jesus do? Well, he illustrates what he had been saying at the climax of the Sermon on the Mount about a wise man building his house upon a rock, because he's a greater than Solomon, wiser than him, and he's building a greater than the temple, and he's doing that in the church when he says, you are Petros, which means rock, the foundation stone, and on this rock I will build my church. And he goes on to promise that the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. And why? Because I'm going to give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven to wield as a power down here on earth, so that what you bind on earth will have been bound in heaven. What you loose on earth will have been loosed in heaven. So you have the royal ministers numbering 12 like Solomon, but between the king and the 12, there is one elevated to be the prime minister. And what does the king entrust to him? The keys of the kingdom. So the church and the kingdom of heaven, focusing on the 12, but especially centering in on Peter and his successors who get the keys of the kingdom. This illustrates once more that when Jesus proclaimed the kingdom and established the church, this was not a broken promise, it wasn't unfulfilled, it wasn't a postponed fulfillment, it was an actual fulfillment, but one that was not expected by most of the people.
And later we see the other apostles get this power of binding and loosing, but the keys are still exclusively in Peter's hand.
That's right. In chapter 18, he gives to all 12 the power to bind and loose. But nowhere in chapter 18 does he give to the 11 the keys as he gave them to Peter alone in chapter 16. And it's interesting, too, because Matthew's the only one of the 4 evangelists who actually shows us Jesus using the word ecclesia, or church, in chapter 16 and again in 18. And so people ask, why is Jesus not referring more to the church? Well, I think the key is to go back to the Old Testament. And the one who uses the term ecclesia more than any other is the chronicler, who displays the Davidic kingdom precisely as a liturgical empire that centers in on the temple. And so Jesus taps into that tradition to show us in Matthew 16 and 18 that the temple, the ecclesia, the assembly of those who are called upon to worship as they would come to Jerusalem for the Passover. This is precisely what Jesus is building. Not a building made of stones, but a living temple made of living stones, beginning with Peter himself, the rock. When we look at it in these terms, the Davidic kingdom covenant illuminates the depth and the degree to which the Catholic Church really fulfills the Davidic covenant in a way that surpasses the understanding and the expectations of first century Palestinian Jews.
I wish we could stay and continue in the Gospel of Matthew, but we are nearly out of time. And so we'll ask for you to join us again, where we're going to continue talking about how our Lord fulfills all of these Old Testament types, but we're going to do so looking at the Gospel of Luke. I hope you'll join us again next week here on Genesis to Jesus.
If you're enjoying what you're learning here on Genesis to Jesus, I want to encourage you to check out the St. Paul Center for Biblical Theology, an apostolate I founded to help Catholics to grow in their faith by reading the Bible from the heart of the Church. There is a wealth of resources on our website, salvationhistory.com, including a free Genesis to Jesus Bible study, or call us at 740-264-9535.